Hello again, everyone. So for this video, we're going to kind of look at some of the limits of how far the progressive movement was willing to go in the early 20th century. And really, we're going to look at some elements of the progressive movement that, by modern standards, would be seen not as progressive, but in fact deeply regressive in nature, particularly those surrounding issues of race and gender. Now, as I mentioned in my previous video, to start off with, one of the issues that Woodrow Wilson did not embrace as a progressive cause that had been part of Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism as part of the Progressive Party platform in 1912 was the issue of women's suffrage. Wilson um, did not embrace suffrage, at least not immediately, and wouldn't come around to embracing it until the First World War. And as a result, you see a new type of activism in the women's suffrage movement emerging during this early phase of his presidency. One that is much more militant and much more confrontational than the kind of, uh, you know, co-opting of existing gender norms that have been advocated by people like uh, Jane Addams and others before her, that kind of played into existing ideas about femininity and gender norms. Um, at Wilson's inauguration, in fact, um, there was a mass protest held by more than 5,000 women who were led by a new voice in the movement for women's suffrage. Her name is Alice Paul, and she represents a new breed of female reformer. Um, she is a byproduct of the push for women's suffrage that emerges out of the UK. There's contemporaneous to the US, there's a push for women's suffrage in the UK. And the push for women's suffrage in the UK oftentimes hinges on very dramatic acts of civil disobedience. Chaining people chaining themselves to public buildings to protest the discrimination and the lack of a political voice that women have. Um, you know, Engaging in hunger strikes, in some cases going to prison, and things like that. And Alice Paul brings that to the progressive movement. And so the version of feminism that she advocates through civil disobedience is much more confrontational than the, sort of, um, you know, we should let women vote because, they're mothers and caregivers and they'll make the political system more open or honest or whatever, that you see people like Jane Addams advocating that kind of idea of municipal housekeeping. Um, for many of the newer uh, feminist activists that emerge in the 19 teens, like Alice Paul, uh, they're not as much interested in pursuing women's suffrage through that lens. They're interested in pursuing equality in and of itself as its own goal. And so, in that sense, they are much more in sync with modern day ideas about equality and feminism that we would recognize today than the, again, kind of co opting of 19th century ideas that earlier feminists represent. So there's this clear divide that emerges in the suffrage movement between the more radical, oftentimes younger activists like Alice Paul and the older, more established activists like Jane Addams and Carrie Chapman Catt of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Um, but one of the things that they, of course, protest is the fact that Wilson won't even consider women's suffrage at the time of his inauguration. And so they do begin engaging in these much more dramatic acts of civil disobedience, these, chaining themselves to the White House fence and getting arrested, engaging in other types of very visible protest. Um, by 1916, Paul ends up forming her own new organization. She breaks away from the National American Women's Suffrage Association and ends up forming a new organization called the National Women's Party, whose principal and only goal is empowering women, first by obtaining women's suffrage, but also seeking, full legal and political equality with men, economic, legal, and political equality with men in the United States. So that's something that emerges partly out of Wilson's resistance to this notion. Now, um, one of the causes that ends up getting linked up with this is the push for birth control, which Margaret Sanger advocates in New York in 1916 when she founds Planned Parenthood and opens the nation's first birth control clinic. It's shut down after a fairly short period of time. It's worth mentioning that at the time, even mentioning birth control or publishing pamphlets about it, much less distributing prophylactics or aborticants or anything like that, was completely illegal and would remain so in many states all the way up until the 1960s. So that was a pretty radical cause, and one that again becomes part of this push for greater equality for women in the United States during this time period. Now, eventually, Sanger would find a more welcoming audience during the 1920s. Unfortunately, she would do so largely by co-opting the language of the eugenics movement, which fundamentally is racist in nature. But the idea of bodily autonomy being a liberal cause is pretty firmly established as a result of this. Now, in addition to Wilson's general hostility towards women's suffrage and to feminist causes, another area where his record very clearly shows that he is a product of his time and the place where he comes from in many ways is his views on race. Wilson, as I mentioned, is significant in a number of ways. He's the first. He's only the second Democrat to be elected to the White House in the 52 years since the election of Abraham Lincoln. But even more significantly, he's the first Southerner to hold to actually have been elected to the presidency since the 1840s, and the first Southerner to hold the office in any way since Andrew Johnson in the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination. And as a Southerner, somebody who was born in Virginia, raised in Georgia, I had that mixed up in one of the other videos, sorry. Wilson brings with him certain Southern attitudes about race. And those Southern attitudes about race had, in the decades before Wilson became president, gained not only widespread acceptance throughout the Southern United States, but also had gained legal sanction through the Supreme Court, as well as gained a certain degree of national acceptance through the new medium of the motion picture. So this is one of the aspects of the progressive era that from modern eyes is anything but progressive and is in fact deeply regressive. Basically during the 1890s, partly in an effort to stop cross-racial alliances between poor whites and poor blacks who periodically in southern states joined up together to form nascent political movements like the Populists in the 1890s, kind of recognizing the fact that they were in the same boat economically. Southern political establishments, which again at this time period is controlled entirely by the Democratic Party, the so-called Solid South, one of the ways that they decide to try to tighten their already iron-tight grip on power in these states is by passing laws that deliberately disenfranchise African Americans and render them into a secondary social status. We've already talked about some of these a little bit. So you see states modeling themselves after laws first passed in 1890 in Mississippi, the so-called Mississippi Plan, that involve poll taxes to keep people away from the polls that they can't afford to vote, which being that most African Americans are very poor in the South means, of course, disenfranchising them in large numbers, as well as many of their potential allies, the poor whites. Then you have literacy tests, which are designed to um, basically weed out people based on oftentimes absurd criteria, based on intellectual fitness, if you will. And of course, the grandfather clause, which basically says if your grandfather could vote in 1860, then you can too, which of course automatically precludes pretty much every African American in these southern states. And so during the 1890s, many southern states raced to pass these laws that disenfranchise African Americans. And the reason that they gave was that this was a progressive reform. They sold this as a progressive reform, stating that, basically, well, we're trying to protect the vote, and this way, there's no, kind of people being coerced or anything like that. And so we're trying to ensure that our elections are clean and honest. And the best way to do that is to make sure that only white people can vote, basically. Um, it's literally how they sell it at this time period. It's as horrible and offensive as that sounds and is. That is literally how it was sold in this time period. This is a reform. In addition to that, many states begin passing laws that segregate public spaces like diners and railway cars and trolleys and schools, especially, um, between whites and blacks. And then, of course, what that does is it puts African Americans into a subordinate position, not just politically, having been deprived of political power, but it also puts them into a subordinate position economically as well, because, of course, certain jobs become off limits, and certain places, and places with typically the places with good schools and access to universities and things like that are off limits. And Wilson embraces this. He sees this as the natural order of things, the right way of doing things. And he illustrates his commitment to, basically maintaining Jim Crow in a number of ways. One of the ways he does this is one of his first acts as president is he orders the segregation of all federal offices and the post office in Washington, D.C., something that none of his predecessors had felt was warranted or necessary. And so he does that. Another thing that he does is he publicly endorses a movie that comes out in 1915 called Birth of a Nation, which is generally regarded as the first feature-length motion picture. It's a groundbreaking movie in a number of ways from a technical perspective. Historically, it is absolutely horrific. It contains an egregious rewriting of history from a Southern narrative. It essentially nationalizes the so-called lost cause narrative of history of the institution of slavery, of the American Civil War, and of Reconstruction that many Southern groups, most notably the Daughters of the Confederacy, had begun advocating in Southern states as part of their history curriculum during the 1890s and the early 20th century. This, to bring up a prescient, issue in contemporary politics, this is incidentally when a lot of those Confederate statues are being built, not coincidentally, just to put that out there. Wilson sees this movie, which basically makes the case that granting social and political equality to African Americans results in them terrorizing the white population. And the movie quite literally portrays the Ku Klux Klan as white knights riding to the rescue. Um, he referred to it as history, history like lightning, and said it's only all so terrible because it's all so true. So he clearly embraces and endorses this decidedly ahistorical narrative of American history, gives it a certain level of legitimacy um, in the process. And as a result, this Southern lost cause narrative of history that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, that slavery really wasn't that bad, and that Reconstruction was a total disaster because we gave too much freedom to black people. Um, all of those ideas gain a, to a large degree, nationwide acceptance during this time period. And it takes decades before that narrative begins to finally be, kind of done away with. But its imprint on popular culture is massive. Not only do you have movies like Birth of a Nation that feature this harmful and decidedly inaccurate narrative about history, but you also have movies like Gone with the Wind, which is, of course, still an immensely popular and influential film that feature this narrative as well. And so Wilson pretty much adopts this idea of history, this narrative of slavery and Reconstruction wholesale, and gives it national endorsement. It had already received legal endorsement. Um, in 1896, about 16 years before Wilson is elected president, the Supreme Court had basically given the green light to segregate to the establishment of the segregationist state in the South in a landmark decision called Plessy v. Ferguson. The case involved a man who was 1/8 African American, you heard that right, who could pass for white, who had bought a rail ticket in the North, but who was forced to give up his seat and sit in the so-called colored car when he reached the South. It was actually designed to be a test case that was designed to illustrate how ludicrous and idiotic these laws were. And it was designed to go to the Supreme Court. It backfired spectacularly. In the end, the Supreme Court, ignoring all other visible evidence to the contrary, finds a unique doctrine. They basically find that this sort of segregation of public spaces and accommodations doesn't violate the 14th Amendment's guarantee to equal protection under the law, which, you know, it is pretty clear on its face what that should mean. Um, and instead finds that so long as the facilities that are available to blacks and whites are, quote, separate but equal, then it is not a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, of course, the reality is that those separate facilities were rarely, if ever, the equal of those available that were available to African Americans, were rarely, if ever, the equal of those available to whites. And so, this is again one of those instances of a court decision that, is made in a vacuum and which completely ignores any objective, information from actual lived reality that people go in. And it becomes the cornerstone of Southern segregation during this time period of Jim Crow. And it will remain in effect all the way until 1954, when the Supreme Court reverses itself in the Brown versus Board of Education. So this is a major ruling that has massive effects on the lives of millions of people, that becomes, again, the legal foundation, the cornerstone of this segregationist apparatus that is put in place in the South, but also in many cases in parts of the North as well. There are many northern cities and towns at this time that adopt what are known as sundown ordinances that require African Americans to vacate before sunset, or else, basically. It's never explicitly stated what the or else is, but everybody knows what it is. And it proves to be a massive obstacle to any kind of meaningful social or economic equality. And so the black community at this point has to try to figure out how they're going to deal with this. And there emerges during this period two distinct schools of thought about how to address this issue. The earliest comes from a man named Booker T. Washington. Washington was born a slave, but after the American Civil War, and after obtaining an education for himself, becomes a leading advocate of African American vocational education and training. In 1881, he founds the Tuskegee Institute, which is sort of meant to be like a school for African Americans that's analogous the the Aggie schools that many states in the South, in particular, build at this time period. The most famous, of course, being Texas A&M. The A&M standing for agricultural and mechanical. So these were schools that were basically designed to teach you how to be a scientific methods of farming, basically, or how to be an engineer, things like that. And so the Tuskegee Institute becomes a model, and because of that, Washington becomes this national figure in the black community. He's probably the one African American figure that many Americans can name in the late 19th, early 20th century. Um, and he, being someone who lives and works in the South, comes to a pretty depressing but hard nosed realization that we're not going to change these people's minds overnight. And so he gives a speech in 1895, just a year before the Plessy v. Ferguson decision is handed down. Um, and because of this, it becomes known as the Atlanta Compromise. And his idea is very simple. It comes to be known as the policy of accommodation. And the basic idea is that, as he put it, in all things purely social, we may be as separate as the fingers, but united as the fists in all things essential to mutual progress. So the idea is that African Americans won't forcefully advocate for political or social equality, but instead will make themselves invaluable members of the community, an economic asset in the South, and that as a result of their efforts over time, and conveniently when this would be specifically is never laid out, because of their economic contributions, they would be rewarded with greater political and social mobility, and greater equality. And so this becomes for a time a approach to dealing with segregation and Jim Crow that is fairly popular. Um, but many immediately dismiss this, seeing it as for what it is, as defeatist and basically tantamount to surrender in this area. Now, before I go further, I do want to mention that privately, Washington did continue behind the scenes to advocate for equality, but publicly his stance would remain for this accommodationist approach. But anyway, so many aren't satisfied with this for pretty obvious reasons, and so they begin looking for an alternative. That alternative comes in the early 20th century from a man named W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois comes from a decidedly different background than Washington. He's not from the South, he's from the North, he's from Massachusetts specifically, so a northeastern state with a long history of support for liberal reforms. And he's an academic. He comes from a relatively affluent black family in Massachusetts. He attends Howard University, gets a PhD in history and political science, and then decides to go to Harvard University. He becomes the first African American to receive a doctoral degree from an Ivy League institution, and he becomes the first African American professor to teach white students at a Ivy League university. So he's coming at this from this decidedly fairly affluent academic standpoint. But nonetheless, he does make a pretty good point about Washington's position. He advocates that it's defeatist, that it denies people economic agency and political agency, that as far as he's concerned, you can't have economic viability without also having social and political equality. The three go hand in hand with one another as far as he's concerned, which they do. Um, and he advocates for trying to systematically dismantle the system of racial oppression that had been put in place in the South, through social agitation, boycotts, and through the use of the courts. Now, Du Bois ends up using his position in this capacity to really put forward a vision that is much more expansive and much more aimed at achieving social equality than what Washington is aiming for. And so, to that end, In 1909, he becomes one of the leading figures in establishing the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is formed along with Du Bois by a number of white progressives that were sympathetic to the cause of racial equality. In his capacity as the editor of the NAACP's quarterly newspaper, The Crisis, Du Bois becomes a leading voice for integration and for overturning the Plessy v. Ferguson decision. And not coincidentally, the NAACP would ultimately, um, during his time with the organization, begin mounting a legal strategy that would attempt to ultimately successfully attempt to systematically chip away bit by bit at the legal foundations of Jim Crow and of the Plessy v. Ferguson decision. And so, in that sense, he represents a decidedly more modern approach to pursuing equality and combating racism than the um, accommodationist approach advocated by Washington. Um, so yeah. Um, so that pretty much concludes this video. That also more or less concludes the lecture on the Progressive Era. For our next video, we're going to begin looking into the causes of the First World War and how that came about, which is going to go a little bit beyond America's borders as we do that.